Hello everyone, welcome to Drishti IAS. You're watching the NCERT Foundation series wherein we study the subject of political science or polity with the help of MCQs and PYQs. Now so far we have covered 4 chapters in the form of 4 topics for your MCQs of the Class 9 Political Science NCERT. These topics were democracy, Constitution, democratic elections, and working of the institutions. Today, we are set to cover the 5th topic or the 5th chapter, which incidentally is also the final chapter of your Class 9 Political Science NCERT, and the chapter is titled Democratic Rights. So, without further ado, let's plunge in. So, this is a quick glance for you. This is the final chapter. Chapter 5 of your Class 9 NCERT. It's titled Democratic Rights. These are the broad topics that we are going to be covering today in the form of MCQs, which is what are rights, fundamental rights in the Indian Constitution, and finally the expanding scope of rights. And with the help of the MCQs that we'll be discussing, your chapter would be covered. Now, let's look at the previous day question. Consider the following statements. The Constitution of India classifies the ministers into 4 ranks, viz. Cabinet Minister, Minister of State with independent charge, Minister of State and Deputy Minister. Now, here's the catch. It says the Constitution of India classifies. No, the Constitution of India does not classify. Actually, this classification is a matter of political convention. The Constitution of India only talks about the Prime Minister and his Council of Ministers. So this classification is actually a matter of political convention. Please remember that. So this statement becomes wrong. Now the second statement says the total number of ministers in the Union government, including the Prime Minister, shall not exceed 15% of the total number of members in the Lok Sabha. This is right. This we also discussed in the preceding section. This is actually correct. And there's also a minimum strength that is prescribed, which is 12. So, the number of ministers in the Council of Ministers should not drop below 12. Alright. So, if we eliminate the first statement over here, we can arrive at the correct answer, which is option number 2. Alright. Option number B. Now let's move on to the first question for today's topic, democratic rights. Consider the following statements. 1. Rights are absolute claims that cannot be restricted. 2. Rights come with obligations to respect the rights of others. 3. Rights are meaningful only when enforceable by law. Now before we attempt the question, let's try and understand what rights are. See, in simple terms, rights are claims. Rights are claims. Alright? And what are rights claim against? They are claim against the state, the society, your fellow beings. Whenever I say I have a right, I'm basically saying that I can claim something against either the state or my fellow citizens or the society. Alright? Now, can I claim literally anything under the sun? Can I claim that tomorrow I am going to be the Prime Minister of India? Can I claim that? Or can I just claim that in the upcoming elections I'm going to cast 100 votes instead of 1? No, my claim has to be reasonable. So this is very important. So you can say rights are reasonable claims. Alright? Now, whenever we talk about rights, we talk about them in the purview of society. So, any rights have to be recognized by the society. Now, imagine you are living outside of the society. You are someone who has absolutely no social interaction, no community which you belong to, and you're living alone in a forest. Will having any right matter at all? Since you're all alone, you can do whatever you wish to. There is no claim that you have to make against anybody. So, rights are discussed only when talked about in the purview of a society, a social setup. So this is again a very important condition of a right. It has to be recognized by a society. All right. Now, another very important thing is that rights have to be legally enforceable. In other words, rights have to be sanctioned by law. Again, the example that we took was that of me waking up and choosing to cast 100 votes in the upcoming elections instead of 1. First of all, it's unreasonable, but let's say in a different society, in a different social setup, it was a reasonable claim. All right, and it was also recognized by the society. That society absolutely agreed with me and said, okay, fine, this person seems like a reasonable person. Let's allow this person to cast 100 votes. However, if it does not have a legal backing, if the government or if the constitution does not legally sanction this desire of mine or this claim of mine, does it have any value? Is it going to be implementable? Can it be enforced? No. So it has to be sanctioned by law. So in the most simple definition, we can understand rights as those reasonable claims that are recognized by the society and that are sanctioned by the law. All right, that is your definition. And of course, when I talk about reasonableness, it means that my rights should not encroach upon the rights of others. My rights should not injure other person's right. Okay, so that of course comes with reasonableness. Now, let's consider the statements again. Rights are absolute claims that cannot be restricted. Now, right about here, you can say this statement to be false because rights are not absolute claim. They are reasonable claims. Okay. And of course, they can be restricted. That's what we talked about when talking about reasonableness. Now, the second statement is rights come with obligations to respect the rights of others, of course. So, my right to exercise freedom should not curtail another person's freedom or another person's right to enjoy some other type of freedom. My right to listen to the loudest music ever should not harm, should not curtail the other person's right to enjoy peace. All right. Of course, there are reasonable restrictions. Now, this is correct. The third statement says, rights are meaningful only when enforceable by law. Of course, we discussed this right about now that rights have meaning only if they have a legal backing or a legal sanction. So, if we eliminate all those options which have first statement, we can arrive at our answer, which is option B. I hope this was clear. Which of the following is not a fundamental right in the Indian Constitution? Option A says right to equality. Right to equality is definitely a fundamental right in part 3. In part 3 of the Indian Constitution. And this is discussed, this is contained in articles 14 to 18. All right. Now the second one is right to vote. Now this one can be a bit tricky. We have discussed the concept of democracy where we have given indispensable value to the right to vote, right? And we would like to believe that this is a fundamental right. However, this is not a fundamental right. This is a constitutional right. This is a constitutional right which is derived from Article 326, which discusses elections. All right. So this is a constitutional right. So we have our correct answer over here, which is option B. Right to freedom, again, is a fundamental right in part 3 of the Constitution and is discussed in articles 19 to 22. Finally, right to constitutional remedies. I would say it is perhaps one of the most important fundamental rights. And this is so because if your fundamental rights are violated, you can approach the courts directly, which means protection against violation of rights itself is a fundamental right and it is guaranteed by Article 32 of the Constitution. So, which one is not a fundamental right? Your right to vote, option B. The right to equality in the Indian Constitution implies which of the following? Now, right to equality we have just discussed, Articles 14 to 18. Let's quickly look at what right to equality means or what it entails. So, Article 14 says equality before law and equal protection of laws. All right. This is Article 14. Article 15 discusses about prohibition of discrimination on the grounds only of religion, race, caste, sex or place of birth. All right. Article 16 talks about equality in the matters of employment. Right. This is the topic of public employment or a chance, fair equality of opportunity in the matters of employment to an office of the state. Article 17 talks about abolition of untouchability. Okay, talks about abolition of untouchability, and Article 18 talks about abolition of titles except military and academic. All right. So we have laid out for you the articles and the provisions under the right to equality. Now let's check one by one. Equality before law, yes, Article 14. Equal protection of law, again, Article 14. Abolition of untouchability, 17, and equality of opportunity in public employment is discussed in Article 16. So basically all your four statements, all your four implications are there contained in the right to equality. Hence, option D is the correct answer. In the Indian context, reservations for disadvantaged groups do not violate the rights to equality because, now see, this is a very common question which might arise in everybody's mind, that why we have right to equality that talks about equality, equal protection of laws, equality before the law all the time, and then we also have this provision of reservation, and somehow they're not violative of each other, they're not contradicting each other. And the reason is because, simply understood, we have the Constitution has provided reservations to those people who are historically marginalized. All right, historically marginalized, and the whole idea about giving them reservation is not to ensure that they are successful, but rather only to provide equal opportunity. All right, reservation in itself is no guarantee of success. Please understand this. This provision over here of reservations is basically so as to ensure that everybody or nobody for that matter faces any sort of disadvantage due to their starting position. All right. So let's say there are three people and they have to cover this distance 1, 2 and 3. Now, of course, the distance for the third person is the shortest. So what would it, and of course, this person is going to win the race because this person is going to easily cover the distance. So what can we do in order to, give everybody an equal chance? We'll probably give this person a head start and this person a head start. This person a little longer head start because the distance covered is longer. This person also will get a head start because still this person has to cover more distance than the third person. All right. So what we are trying to do here is that we are trying to provide an opportunity so that nobody suffers due to their initial or their starting position. Okay, nobody suffers or nobody is at an undue advantage. All right, if we were not giving this head start to any of them, contestant number 3 would win the race hands down. All right, so equality means identical treatment of all individuals. It actually doesn't, to be honest. So no, reservation actually does not imply this. B, equality allows differential treatment to ensure equal opportunity. This happens to be your correct answer over here. C, reservations are temporary measures outside the scope of equality. No, reservations are very much within the scope of equality. And D, reservations are mandated only by state policies and not constitutional provisions. Again, a straightforward no. So we arrive at the right answer. Question 5, which of the following does not come under the right to freedom in India? Now, we have discussed a bit earlier that Articles 19 through 22 discuss the right to freedom in India, right, under the Constitution, Part 3. All right. Now, let's discuss the various rights that come under the right to freedom. All right. Now, in the very beginning, let's say Article 19 talks about, I believe, six freedoms. 6 freedoms in Article 19 itself are provided to the citizens. What are those freedoms? They are right to freedom of speech and expression. All right, freedom of speech and expression. The next is right to assemble peaceably and without arms. Right to assemble peaceably and without arms. The third right to freedom is right to form associations or unions. All right, so that is also a freedom that has been guaranteed by the Constitution. You can form associations and you can form unions. Next, right to move freely. Right to move freely throughout the territory of India. Okay. Next, slightly different than this. Now, this talks about the right to move freely throughout the territory of India. The next provision talks about right to permanently reside or settle in any part of India. Okay. And finally, there is the right to carry out any profession. You have the right to carry out any profession or to run any occupation, trade or business. All right. So these are the guarantees, the 6 guarantees that are provided under Article 19 itself. Now, there are also Article 20, 21, 21A and 22. But for this question, knowing these guarantees is going to serve our purpose. All right. So, A says freedom of speech and expression. Yes, this is guaranteed. So, does not seem to be the right answer. Freedom to form associations or unions. Yes, we discussed. It is in fact guaranteed. All right. Freedom to practice any profession or occupation. Again, guaranteed. And freedom to acquire property. Actually, no, this is not guaranteed anywhere. This is also not guaranteed in rights 20, 21, 21A and rights 22, which also happen to be part of freedom, the right to freedom. Question 6, under the right to freedom, which of the following restrictions can be imposed by the state? Now, these are certain restrictions that have been given to you. And we've already discussed while discussing about rights itself that they come with certain restrictions. Okay. They are reasonable only because there are certain obligations that one must follow in order to exercise their rights freely. So we are talking about right to freedom, and right to freedom actually does come with certain restrictions. Now you can be free you can be free to speak and express as you so wish, all right, or you can form your trade unions and associations, and you can assemble peaceably, you can assemble without arms. But all of these freedoms, all of these guarantees are subject to certain restrictions. Let's see one by one. First and foremost, you cannot harm the sovereignty or integrity. Sovereignty and integrity of the state. All right? So you can feel free to speak your mind out, but it should not injure the sovereignty and integrity of the state. All right? Again, related term. It should not jeopardize the security of the state. All right? It should not jeopardize the security of the state. Again, it should not harm friendly relations with other states. So suppose you're making speeches and then you're criticizing nations that we have friendly relations with, and your speech actually does tarnish those relations, it is not going to be accepted as a rightful exercise of your right to freedom. All right? So these are 3 state-related restrictions that are imposed, that all these guarantees are subject to. All right? Now, not just this, there's another restriction, which is public order. So your freedom cannot create a ruckus or a chaos in society. It cannot disrupt public order. Similarly, it is subject to decency or morality. All right? It is subject to decency or morality. You cannot do something or express something obscene in the name of freedom. All right? There is a reasonable restriction that has been imposed on that freedom. Finally, contempt of court is not permitted. You cannot disrespect or dishonor the dignity of the court. Anything related to defamation, okay? You cannot defame another person. You cannot defame another person. And finally, incitement to offense. Fine? Incitement to any offense. This, you cannot actually incite people or instigate people to commit offenses. That is not a part of your freedom. All right? So from here, we can say public order is a part of the restriction, morality is a part of the restriction, security of the state is also a part of the restriction, but we have not discussed promotion of regional languages. No, this is not one of the reasons why your freedom would be curtailed or reasonably restricted. All right? So, right off the bat, all options containing the fourth statement is eliminated, and we have again option B as your right answer. Which of the following rights are available to religious groups in India? Now, Articles 25 to 28 talk about right to freedom of religion in India, which means there are certain rights, certain religious rights that are available to the citizens of India. All right? What are those rights? Let's say, it says right to propagate religion through coercion. This is obviously not right. Basically, right to profess, practice, and propagate. This is Article 25. All right? Freedom of conscience and right to profess, practice, and propagate any religion. That is your freedom to religion, freedom of religion, and article number 25. Now, of course, this is also subject to certain restrictions, like you cannot use force, you cannot coerce people to convert them to your religion. All right? Then we have article 26, which is basically right to manage own religious affairs. Now, this also includes the freedom to establish and administer certain religious institutions. You're very much permitted to do that. All right. This also a part of 26. All right. Now, 27 article says freedom from taxation for the purposes of promoting a particular religion. So, I cannot be compelled to pay taxes so that somebody else or the government can promote a particular religion. I have that freedom from payment of taxes. All right. That is article 27. And finally, freedom from religious instruction in educational institutions. Okay. This is your article 28. So, I cannot be, at least in a state-sponsored educational institution, I cannot be compelled to attend religious instruction. All right. So, let's see, now that we have the list of rights over here, let's see, right to manage their own religious affairs, that is, like I said, available as a right to religion under Article 26. The second one says right to propagate their religion through coercion. No, this was a reasonable restriction to this right. You can practice, profess and propagate your religion, but you cannot coerce people to convert to a certain religion. Third option says right to establish institutions for religious purposes. Very well. It is permitted under Article 26. And the fourth option is right to receive taxes. Right to receive taxes for promotion of religion. Now, please notice here that Article 27 says there's a freedom from taxation to promote religion. Now, if I have the right to be free from any sort of taxation, do you think there can be a right to receive taxation? Absolutely not, right? So, we can eliminate this. So, only 1 and 3 are correct. And here we arrive at the right answer, which is option number A. Which of the following practices would directly violate right against exploitation? Now, right against exploitation are discussed in Articles 23 and 24. Okay. Now, a couple of things have to be borne in mind over here. One, right against exploitation under Article 23 talks about human trafficking. Okay. Human trafficking and begar, which is some kind of a forced labor, and Article 23 actually protects from exploitation against human trafficking as well as begar and other forms of forced labor. All right. And Article 24 prohibits the employment of children below the age of 14 years in certain occupations which are primarily hazardous in nature. Okay. So, these are the basics of what you need to understand about right against exploitation. Now, which of the following practices would directly violate this right? Let's see. Reservation in educational institutions. I don't think it's violating this right. I also don't think we've sufficiently discussed that reservations are not a violation of anybody's right to equality. All right. So, no. Prohibition of religious conversions by law. No. This actually does not violate, it does violate the freedom of religion, all right, under Article 25, but it does not violate the right against exploitation. See, employment of children below 14 years in mines, yes, this is directly violating the right against exploitation. And the denial of entry into places of worship, this is violating the right to equality but not the right against exploitation. So we have the correct answer, which is option number C in this case. I hope this is making sense. So let's move on to the 9th question. The cultural and educational rights are provided in the Constitution to protect. Now, when we talk about cultural and educational rights, we are talking about Articles 29 and Article 30. Now, Article 29 has to do with protection of interests of the minorities, okay? It has to do with the protection of interests of the minorities. And what it basically specifies is that any section of the population, it's not talking about individuals over here, it's talking about a section of population residing anywhere in India, which has a distinct language, culture, or script. Language, culture, and or script. All right? These have the right to be protected. These ought to be protected. And Article 30 talks about the rights of minorities to establish and to administer educational institutions. Now notice that a similar right was also provided under Article 26 in the freedom of religion, right? So we can say that our constitution actually provides protection to the minorities which are religious as well as cultural minorities. All right. So let's look at the options. A, majority communities from discrimination. No, cultural and education rights have nothing to do with the majority, but instead to do with the minority. We just saw Article 29. B, minorities from being assimilated into the majority culture. This is actually right because Article 29 says that we ought to protect the interests of the minorities and especially the distinct language, culture and script so that they're not homogenized with the majority. They are not assimilated with the majority. Option C says scheduled castes and scheduled tribes from caste oppression. No, we actually have different provisions for those in the rights of equality, right? We have the abolition of untouchability as well. We have equal protection of laws and we also have equality of opportunity. And D, women from religious practices which treat them as inferior. So no, there are two aspects here. First, religious practices. Again, there are reasonable restrictions when we are talking about religion, as well as the fact that women cannot be discriminated against on the basis of their sex. All right. So we have the correct answer, which again is option B in this case. The last question. Consider the following statements regarding the right to constitutional remedies. 1. It was described by B.R. Ambedkar as the heart and soul of the Constitution. Absolutely correct. Imagine that the right to have your fundamental rights protected is itself guaranteed in the Constitution. Of course, it is the heart and soul of the Constitution. Second, it allows citizens to directly approach the High Courts or Supreme Court for enforcement of fundamental rights. Absolutely correct. Now, citizens can approach the High Courts under Article 226 and they can issue writs, not the citizens, the courts. And Supreme Court again directly under Article 32. All right. 3. It includes the power of courts to issue writs like habeas corpus and mandamus. Now, writs are basically tools. Let's understand it very simply. They are basically tools to address any sort of injustice or any sort of right violation. Now, all these habeas corpus and mandamus, we're going to discuss as the series progresses. All right. But for now, please understand, yes, this is actually correct. All right. So 1, 2 and 3, all of the above are correct. Hence, we have our correct answer, which is option number D. Now, this is your practice question. Kindly take a look at it and we'll discuss it in our next session. So here we have the various safeguards, we have various rights that have been given, and here we have a corresponding constitutional safeguard. Okay, so these are rights, these are safeguards. Kindly take a look at it and we'll discuss it in the upcoming lecture. Now, if you really liked today's video, kindly press the like button, share and subscribe with others, and we'll meet again with this question and of course with Class 10 NCERT beginning with Chapter 1. Thanks for watching.
For more informative content, like, share and subscribe. And do not forget to press the bell icon to get the notifications.